My sister announced her third pregnancy, and my parents actually cheered. While the applause was still ringing in the restaurant, my mother slid a printed schedule across the tablecloth directly to me. It listed school drop-offs, meal prep, and overnight babysitting. When I asked why I was being handed a chore list, my sister snapped that I was 35, single, and had nothing better to do. I did not argue. I just paid the bill in cash and walked out. But the real shock came the next morning at 6 when my phone rang. A detective was on the line asking why my signature was on a fraudulent wire transfer for $250,000. The atmosphere at the steakhouse in Buckhead was suffocating long before the baby announcement was ever made. We were supposed to be celebrating my parents' 40th wedding anniversary. Calvin and Valerie loved holding court in places with valet parking, crystal chandeliers, and waiters who memorized their drink orders. It made them feel like Atlanta royalty, projecting an image of generational wealth and flawless family unity that did not actually exist behind closed doors. I sat at the far edge of the heavy mahogany table, sipping my sparkling water and waiting for the inevitable moment when the conversation would turn against me. It was a family tradition I had come to expect. It happened right after the expensive seafood appetizers were cleared away. Jada, my younger sister, proudly tapped her silver spoon against her crystal champagne flute. She stood up glowing in a designer maternity dress that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and loudly announced that baby number 3 was officially on the way. My parents erupted into absolute joy. Trent, my white brother-in-law, smiled smugly and kissed Jada's cheek. He always looked so incredibly pleased with himself, perfectly playing the role of the ultimate provider in commercial real estate. As the congratulations and toasts died down, Valerie reached into her oversized designer handbag. She pulled out a thick, meticulously stapled packet of paper and slid it across the white linen tablecloth. It glided past the bread basket and stopped right next to my water glass. I looked down at the document. It was a calendar completely color-coded and broken down by the hour for the next 9 months. I saw heavily blocked-out times for morning school runs to the private academy across town, afternoon soccer practices, organic meal preparations, and mandatory weekend overnight stays. I kept my hands in my lap and asked my mother what exactly I was looking at. Valerie smiled, but her eyes were completely devoid of warmth. She told me that with Jada expecting another baby, the family needed extra hands on deck. Trent was busy closing vital commercial real estate deals to secure their future, and Jada needed to rest her body to protect the new baby. Therefore, my parents had generously taken the liberty of mapping out my new weekly responsibilities to help raise my niece and nephew. I stared at the color-coded paper, then looked directly at my sister. I asked her why she was handing me a full-time nanny schedule without even having the decency to ask for my permission. Jada rolled her eyes and let out a dramatic, exasperated sigh. She leaned across the table and told me I was 35 years old, unmarried, and completely single. She said it was not like I had a real family of my own to take care of, so my schedule was obviously wide open. She smirked and told me I should just consider it free training for whenever I finally decided to settle down and find a husband. I kept my voice completely level. I refused to give them the emotional reaction they were baiting me for. I calmly reminded them that I run a highly demanding crisis management firm, a business that requires me to be on call for corporate clients around the clock. I told them I did not have 30 extra hours a week to play unpaid babysitter for children I did not choose to bring into the world. Valerie let out a loud, mocking laugh that made the waiter at the next table turn his head in our direction. She waved her hand dismissively, her diamond rings catching the restaurant light. She said my little public relations business was just me sitting on a laptop in my pajamas sending emails all day. She insisted I could easily send my little emails from Jada's living room while keeping an eye on the toddlers. She then pointed across the table at Trent, loudly praising him for doing real, important work that actually built things and provided for a family, unlike my silly internet hobbies. My internet hobby had grossed 7 figures last year, but I kept my mouth shut. There was absolutely no point in arguing facts with people who preferred to live in their own convenient fiction. My parents had always operated this way when it came to Jada and me. When I was in college, I worked grueling night shifts at a hotel front desk to pay my own tuition because Calvin and Valerie claimed they were completely broke and could not spare a dime for my education. Yet exactly 3 years later, they somehow managed to remortgage their entire house, to pay for Jada's extravagant country club wedding. Jada was the undeniable golden child who married the right man, moved to the right suburb, and produced the right grandchildren. I was just the scapegoat, the spare part they expected to use whenever it was convenient for their narrative. I pushed the color-coded schedule back across the table until it rested in front of my mother. I looked directly at Jada and told her absolutely not. I told her I would not be doing morning school drop-offs, I would not be preparing organic meals, and I would not be sacrificing my business to fund her lifestyle choices. Trent leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on the table. His face flushed bright red with sudden irritation. He pointed a finger at me and told me I was being incredibly selfish and toxic. He said a real family steps up for each other, and that I should be grateful they were even willing to include me in their children's lives. He looked me up and down and said I owed my free time to a real family since I had failed to build one myself. My father Calvin had been sitting quietly sipping his bourbon until that exact moment. He slammed his fist down on the table, making the fine china and silverware rattle against the plates. He glared at me and demanded I show some respect to my mother and my sister. He said I was embarrassing the family in public. He leaned in close and threatened that if I did not step up and do my duty to this family, he would call his lawyer first thing Monday morning and write me completely out of my grandmother's estate. I thought the threat of losing an inheritance would bring me to my knees. He thought I was still the terrified 20-year-old girl begging for their basic approval and support. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I calmly opened my designer purse and pulled out a stack of $100 bills I had withdrawn earlier that day. I counted out $1,200 in crisp cash and placed the money neatly on top of their ridiculous babysitting schedule. I told Calvin to go ahead and keep the inheritance. I told him, looking straight into his angry eyes, that he might actually need the money to pay off the second mortgage he took out for Jada's wedding. I stood up, grabbed my wool coat from the back of the chair, and told them their anniversary dinner was on me. Then I turned around and walked out of the crowded steakhouse. I did not stop or look back when Valerie shouted my name across the dining room. I walked out into the cool Atlanta night, got into my car, and drove back to my townhouse. I felt a strange, profound sense of peace settling over my chest. I genuinely thought the worst part of my toxic family dynamics was finally behind me. I thought walking away and setting a firm boundary was the end of the conflict. I could not have been more wrong. The next morning, I woke up early to the sound of rain hitting my bedroom window. I was standing in my kitchen making a cup of black coffee, getting ready to review a major client portfolio when my cell phone started ringing. I glanced at the microwave clock. It was exactly 6 in the morning. I did not recognize the incoming local number, but in my specific line of work, a phone call at 6 in the morning usually means a corporate client is facing an absolute public relations emergency. I cleared my throat and answered the phone with my standard professional greeting. A deep, unfamiliar male voice came through the speaker. He asked if he was speaking to Kendra. I confirmed my identity, asking who was calling so early. He introduced himself as a detective with the Financial Crimes Unit of the Atlanta Police Department. The rigid tone of his voice immediately made my stomach drop to the floor. It was the kind of clinical, detached tone law enforcement uses when they are dealing directly with a suspect, not a victim. I gripped the edge of my granite countertop and asked him how I could help him, automatically assuming this was a routine inquiry related to one of the high-profile corporate accounts my firm managed. The detective told me I needed to come down to the downtown precinct immediately. He said someone had filed a formal criminal complaint involving grand theft and corporate fraud. I set my coffee mug down so hard, some of the dark liquid splashed onto the counter. I asked him what company he was currently investigating. He said they were investigating my company. He told me a local commercial bank had flagged a highly suspicious fraudulent bridge loan for $250,000. The massive funds had been wired out to an offshore holding account and completely drained overnight. I told the detective there must be some kind of terrible mistake or a system error. I explained very clearly that my crisis management firm had absolutely not applied for any commercial bridge loans, and we certainly had not authorized an overnight wire transfer for $250,000. The detective was quiet for a long, agonizing moment. Then he delivered the blow that brought my entire reality crashing down around me. He said it was not a system mistake. He said they had the original commercial loan application and the final wire transfer authorization forms sitting right there on his desk. And the primary corporate guarantor on the paperwork, the person who had legally signed off on the $250,000 debt and authorized the transfer, was me. He said my verified signature and my firm's tax identification numbers were on every single page of the fraudulent documents. The breath completely left my lungs. I knew with absolute certainty I had not signed anything, but I also knew exactly who had old copies of my personal financial files, who ran a commercial real estate business that was desperately bleeding money, and who was arrogant enough to frame me for a federal crime after I humiliated him and walked out on his family the night before. The sharp ringing of my phone cut through the quiet of my kitchen, exactly at 6 in the morning. I stared at the unknown local number flashing on the screen. In my line of work, building crisis management software for high-profile corporate clients, an early morning call usually meant a server had crashed or a major client was facing a public relations disaster. I cleared my throat, smoothed down the lapel of my silk robe, and answered with my standard professional greeting. The voice on the other end did not belong to a panicked corporate executive. It was deep, clinical, and completely detached. The man introduced himself as Detective Davis with the Financial Crimes Unit of the Atlanta Police Department. The rigid authority in his tone made my stomach drop instantly. He told me I needed to come down to the downtown precinct immediately. When I asked him why, he said someone had filed a formal criminal complaint against me involving grand theft and corporate fraud. He said a local commercial bank had flagged a highly suspicious bridge loan for $250,000, and the funds had been wired to an offshore holding account and drained overnight. I told him there must be a mistake, that my tech firm had never applied for a commercial bridge loan. There was a long, heavy pause on the line before he delivered the blow that shattered my reality. He said they had the original application and wire authorization forms sitting right on his desk, and the primary corporate guarantor who had legally signed off on the debt was me. I did not panic. I did not scream or cry or beg him to believe me. I simply told him I would be there in 20 minutes. I walked into my bedroom, put on a sharp-tailored charcoal suit, and drove my car straight to the downtown precinct. The Atlanta police station was cold, smelling of stale coffee and industrial floor cleaner. It was a stark contrast to the plush, velvet-lined steakhouse where my family had ambushed me just hours earlier. Detective Davis met me in the lobby and escorted me to a small, windowless interrogation room. He slid a thick manila folder across the metal table. I opened it and stared at the documents. It was a massive commercial loan application for my brother-in-law, Trent, and his failing real estate holding company. Right there on the bottom line, next to my company tax identification number, was a perfect forgery of my signature. Trent had used the financial credentials of my crisis management tech firm to secure a desperate lifeline for his sinking business. I looked up at the detective, my voice completely steady. I told him I had never seen these papers in my life and that my brother-in-law had forged my signature. Detective Davis leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. He said he would normally investigate a forgery claim, but there was a complicating factor. He pulled another document from the folder and placed it in front of me. It was a formal police report filed at 2 in the morning. The complainant was my sister Jada. I read the words printed on the page and felt a cold, sickening wave of betrayal wash over my entire body. Jada had filed a report claiming that when I stormed out of my parents' anniversary dinner the night before, I had gone straight to her house and stolen a diamond heirloom necklace worth $250,000. She claimed I stole the necklace out of pure spite because I was jealous of her third pregnancy. The trap they had set for me was beautifully malicious. Trent forged the loan to steal $250,000 from a bank using my name. Then, to cover the missing funds and explain why I suddenly had a massive debt attached to my company, Jada fabricated a story about me stealing jewelry of the exact same value. They knew I had a strained relationship with the family. They knew I had walked out of the dinner in a visible state of anger. They figured the police would look at a bitter, 35-year-old single woman who just had a public fight with her pregnant sister and immediately assume she was guilty of a vindictive robbery. They thought I would be so overwhelmed, so terrified of going to prison, that I would just quietly accept the debt to avoid a messy public trial that could destroy my software company. They thought they had backed me into a corner where I had absolutely no way out. They completely underestimated who they were dealing with. I closed the folder and pushed it back to the detective. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of fear. I reached into my designer purse and pulled out my cell phone. I told Detective Davis that my sister was a convincing liar, but she was terrible at math, and even worse at timelines. I opened the encrypted application that controls the security system for my corporate office building. I turned the screen toward him and hit play on the cloud storage footage from the previous night. The crystal clear high-definition video showed my car pulling into the secure underground parking garage of my office building exactly 18 minutes after I walked out of the steakhouse. The next video clip showed me swiping my security badge at the front desk, exchanging a clear time-stamped wave with the night guard, and walking into my private suite. The final piece of footage showed me sitting at my desk working on my computer from 9:30 at night until 5 in the morning. I looked the detective dead in the eye and pointed at the screen. I told him it was physically impossible for me to have driven to the suburbs, broken into my sister's heavily alarmed mansion, stolen a diamond necklace, and made it back to downtown Atlanta, all while being recorded sitting in my office chair. I watched the detective's expression shift from rigid suspicion to profound realization. The fake theft timeline Jada had carefully constructed was instantly and irrefutably shattered by raw digital evidence. He let out a slow breath and wrote something down on his legal pad. He told me the theft charge would be dropped immediately, but the forged commercial loan was still a massive federal issue. He warned me that Trent's real estate company was now under the jurisdiction of federal financial investigators, and I would have to formally testify against my own brother-in-law. I stood up, smoothed out my suit jacket, and told the detective I would be more than happy to testify. I walked out of the precinct with my blood practically boiling in my veins. The sheer audacity of what they had tried to do to me was staggering. Trent had committed a federal crime to save his own skin, and Jada had weaponized the police against her own flesh and blood to cover it up. I got into my car and bypassed the highway exits that would have taken me home. I drove straight toward the affluent manicured suburbs where Jada and Trent lived in their oversized, pretentious mansion. The morning sun was just starting to burn off the fog as I pulled up to their wrought iron driveway gates. I did not bother buzzing the intercom. I used the emergency override code Jada had given me years ago when she needed me to bail her out of a different crisis. The heavy gates swung open, and I drove my car right up to the front steps. I did not ring the doorbell. I did not knock politely. I grabbed the door handle, pushed my way inside, and marched straight down the echoing hallway toward their massive marble kitchen. The smell of expensive espresso and artificial vanilla filled the air. I expected to find Trent and Jada scrambling to get their stories straight. What I did not expect was to find my parents, Valerie and Calvin, already standing in the kitchen sipping coffee from porcelain mugs, as if this was just a normal, peaceful Sunday morning. They had clearly rushed over to support Jada and Trent, probably celebrating the fact that they had finally put the arrogant, independent daughter in her place. The moment I stepped into the kitchen, the casual conversation stopped dead. Jada gasped and grabbed the edge of the marble island, her eyes widening in genuine panic as she realized I was not sitting in a jail cell. Trent dropped his coffee mug into the sink with a loud clatter. I took a step forward, ready to demand exactly why he thought he could forge my signature on a $250,000 federal document. But before I could even open my mouth to speak, my mother moved. Valerie rushed forward and physically planted herself right in front of Trent, shielding her white son-in-law, like he was a fragile victim under attack. She pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at my face. Her voice echoed off the high ceilings as she started screaming at me. She did not ask me if I was okay. She did not ask me what happened at the police station. Instead, my own mother looked me in the eye and accused me of trying to ruin their lives. She screamed that I was a bitter, jealous, toxic woman who was trying to send an innocent white man to prison just because I could not stand to see my own sister pregnant and happy. Valerie's screams bounced off the imported subway tile of their pristine kitchen. I stood there completely still, letting the sheer absurdity of her words wash over me. She was looking at her own flesh and blood, a daughter who had built a successful life entirely from scratch, and she was deliberately choosing to protect a man who had just committed a federal financial crime. I looked past my mother's pointing finger and locked eyes with Trent. He did not look scared. He looked incredibly comfortable, leaning casually against the expensive stainless steel refrigerator he had likely purchased with stolen money. My father, Calvin, stepped forward, placing himself right beside my mother. He always played the role of the booming, authoritative patriarch, the man who cared about exactly one thing in this world, the family reputation. He put his heavy hands on the kitchen island and told me I needed to calm down and look at the bigger picture. He actually had the nerve to use his deep, placating church voice on me. He said Trent just made a minor clerical error to keep his business afloat during a tough quarter. Calvin told me that sending Trent to prison would destroy the family name and ruin Jada's life permanently. He demanded I contact the bank, immediately claim the loan was officially authorized, and take full responsibility for the debt. He said a strong family protects its own. He looked at me with cold expectation and stated that since I had so much disposable income from my tech business, absorbing $250,000 was the absolute least I could do for my pregnant sister. I stared at the man who had flatly refused to co-sign my first apartment lease because he said I was a bad investment. Now he was ordering me to absorb massive corporate fraud to save a white man who had forged my name. I told Calvin that forgery was not a clerical error. I told him it was a felony. That is when Trent finally spoke. He walked around the island and wrapped his arm protectively around Jada's pregnant belly, playing the perfect devoted husband. He smiled a slow, condescending smirk that made my skin crawl. He slid a thick stack of stapled papers across the marble surface. It was a retroactive non-disclosure agreement and a formal loan assumption contract. His legal team had obviously been working overtime to cover his tracks. Trent lowered his voice, adopting the tone of a reasonable businessman negotiating a minor corporate merger. He told me I needed to sign the papers and let this whole misunderstanding go. He said if I decided to be difficult and involve the federal authorities, he would personally make sure my crisis management firm never landed another corporate contract in the city of Atlanta. He bragged about his vast network. He reminded me of the elite country club members he played golf with, the commercial developers he drank expensive bourbon with, and the powerful men who would absolutely take the word of a charismatic real estate developer over a single angry black woman. He said he would spread vicious rumors that my firm was financially unstable and professionally toxic. He was openly threatening to destroy my entire life work if I did not gladly accept his crime. I looked down at the non-disclosure agreement. I did not touch it. I looked at my mother, who was nodding in agreement with Trent's threats. I looked at my father, who was holding out a silver pen for me to sign my own execution order. Then I looked at Jada. My sister stood there in her designer maternity clothes, rubbing her stomach, looking at me with pure, unadulterated entitlement. She fully expected me to sacrifice my company, my hard-earned reputation, and my freedom, so she could keep living in a fake mansion and pretending her life was perfect. I did not yell. I kept my voice perfectly level, stripping away every ounce of emotion until nothing but cold, hard truth remained. I looked Jada directly in the eye. I told her I was not signing a single page. I told her she married a criminal and I was going to let the federal government deal with him. I told her she better start packing her bags right now because the lavish lifestyle she was so desperate to protect was completely over. The reaction was instantaneous. Jada did not apologize. She did not ask Trent if what I was saying was true. She already knew exactly what he was. Instead, she went into absolute survival mode. Jada pulled her cell phone out of her pocket and hit record. Her entire demeanor changed in a fraction of a second. She started hyperventilating, forcing huge theatrical tears down her cheeks. She backed away from me, holding her phone up to record my face. She started screaming, her voice pitched high with fake terror. She cried to the camera that her sister had broken into her home. She screamed that I was physically threatening her husband, and trying to cause so much stress that she would lose her unborn baby. She sobbed, begging me to leave her family alone, begging me to stop being so jealous and hateful just because she was happy. Valerie immediately jumped into the camera frame, wrapping her arms around Jada, crying and yelling at me to get out of the house before I killed my own niece or nephew. Calvin stepped toward me, raising his hands as if he needed to physically protect his pregnant daughter from a violent monster. It was a beautifully orchestrated, deeply sickening performance. They were creating a false narrative right in front of my eyes, crafting the perfect digital weapon to destroy me. I did not try to snatch the phone away. I did not raise my voice to defend myself on camera. I knew exactly how crisis media worked. Any reaction from me, any sudden movement or raised voice would just be used as fuel for their manufactured fire. I simply turned around, walked out the front door, and got back into my car. As I drove away from the sprawling, fraudulent estate, I felt a strange sense of clarity. The family I thought I had, however flawed or dysfunctional, did not actually exist. They were willing to sacrifice me completely to save their own image. I drove back to my downtown office to prepare for the inevitable fallout. I knew Trent and Jada were desperate, but I severely underestimated exactly how far they were willing to go to control the narrative. 2 hours later, I was sitting at my desk, reviewing the digital security logs from the bank, when my private office line rang. It was not my lawyer. It was the chief executive officer of my biggest corporate client, a national logistics company that provided 30% of my firm's annual revenue. He did not bother with pleasant greetings. He sounded alarmed. He asked me what on earth was going on with my family. My stomach tightened. I opened my internet browser and searched my sister's name. It was everywhere. Jada had posted the heavily edited, tearful video across all her social media platforms. She had hundreds of thousands of views within 2 hours. She had attached a long, heartbreaking caption claiming her wealthy, toxic sister was trying to ruin her marriage and render her pregnant sister homeless out of pure, bitter jealousy. She painted herself as the innocent, devoted mother being viciously persecuted by a heartless corporate executive who cared more about money than her own blood. The video was going viral. Local blogs were picking it up. Atlanta gossip pages were reposting the footage, tagging my crisis management firm, tagging my corporate clients, and demanding I be canceled. The comments were flooded with strangers calling me a monster, demanding my clients drop me, and praising Jada for being so brave. My own sister had weaponized the internet to destroy my business, to force me into submission, and to distract the world from the fact that her husband was a thief. The phone lines in my office lobby started lighting up continuously. My assistant knocked on my door looking terrified. The smear campaign had officially begun. I took a slow, measured breath before answering the chief executive officer of my largest corporate client. He was demanding to know why my name and my crisis management firm were suddenly trending across local news blogs, alongside allegations of elder abuse and familial theft. I did not panic. I did not raise my voice or sound like a frantic victim trying to defend her honor. I sounded exactly like the high-powered executive. He paid a massive monthly retainer to keep his own logistics company out of the headlines. I told him calmly that I was currently the victim of a coordinated smear campaign designed to distract from an active federal fraud investigation involving my brother-in-law. I assured him that my legal team was already handling the defamation and that my firm's operational integrity was completely uncompromised. I spoke with such absolute, unwavering authority that by the time I hung up the phone 5 minutes later, he had apologized for overstepping and reaffirmed his contract with my firm. But saving my biggest client was only the first fire I had to put out that morning. When I stepped out of my private office, my entire firm was in a state of controlled chaos. The phones at the front reception desk were ringing incessantly. My assistant, a sharp young woman who usually handled high-stakes corporate leaks without breaking a sweat, looked physically sick as she transferred another barrage of calls to voicemail. The video Jada posted was spreading like wildfire. She had expertly utilized every single algorithm trigger available. She used the pregnant, distressed mother angle. She used the wealthy, heartless corporate sister angle. She tagged Atlanta community pages, local church groups, and neighborhood watch forums. She had manufactured a digital lynch mob and pointed them directly at my front door. I walked back to my desk and opened my personal cell phone. My inbox was overflowing with hateful text messages and voicemails from extended family members who had watched Jada cry on camera and instantly swallowed every single lie. I listened to a voicemail from my aunt, a woman who only called me when she needed free public relations advice for her church bake sales. Her voice dripped with absolute disgust as she asked how I could possibly freeze my pregnant sister's bank accounts and try to throw her out on the street. She said my parents had given me everything, and this was how I repaid them. She called me a selfish, career-obsessed woman who cared more about designer suits and corporate contracts than my own flesh and blood. I deleted the voicemail and let out a harsh, bitter laugh at the phrase "gave me everything." My extended family loved to believe the narrative my parents sold at their country club dinners. They loved to believe Calvin and Valerie were these benevolent, successful patriarchs who paved the way for their daughters. The reality was a completely different story. I built my crisis management firm from absolute scratch. I paid my own way through college working graveyard shifts at a downtown hotel because my parents claimed they were entirely broke and could not spare a single dime for my tuition. I ate instant ramen for 3 years, saving every paycheck to afford my first small office space, teaching myself corporate communication strategies late into the night. Yet somehow, just a few years later, Calvin and Valerie miraculously found the money to completely drain their own retirement accounts and take out a second mortgage on their home. They did not do it to invest in my growing business. They did it to fund Jada and Trent's lavish destination wedding in Europe. They did it to pay the massive down payment on the sprawling suburban mansion Jada was currently using as a backdrop for her victim video. Trent was the white knight in shining armor, the brilliant venture capitalist who was going to elevate the family name and build generational wealth. I was just the workaholic spinster they expected to fall in line and clean up their messes. And now they were trying to destroy the empire I built with my own 2 hands to save the very man who was actively robbing them blind. By early afternoon, the smear campaign escalated from social media posts to coordinated media appearances. My media monitoring software alerted me that Jada and Valerie had secured a guest spot on a highly popular Atlanta morning podcast. I watched the live stream from my computer monitor, my face completely expressionless. My mother was sitting on a plush velvet studio couch, dabbing at her dry eyes with a tissue. She looked directly into the camera and told the host that she prayed every single night for my hardened heart. She claimed that the corporate world had turned me cold and ruthless, and that I was trying to financially ruin Trent just because he was a successful white man, and I resented my sister's perfect interracial marriage. Jada sat next to her, gently rubbing her pregnant belly, nodding tearfully, and claiming she was terrified I would use my wealth to take her children away. My communications director rushed into my office holding a drafted press release. She begged me to let her publish a formal statement to counter the narrative. She wanted to release the security footage proving I was at the office during the supposed necklace theft. She wanted to publicly state that Trent was under investigation. I told her absolutely not. I instructed my entire staff to implement a total media blackout. We would not release a single statement. We would not respond to a single blog post. I knew the golden rule of crisis management better than anyone else in the city. You never roll around in the mud with pigs because you both get dirty, but the pig actually likes it. Jada and Valerie wanted me to fight back publicly. They wanted a messy, emotional social media war because it would validate their claim that I was erratic and vindictive. It would create a smokescreen of family drama that Trent could hide behind while the federal authorities circled him. I was not going to give them a smokescreen. I was going to give them a burial. I picked up my secure phone line and called in a major favor. I contacted David, a former federal agent, who now operated as the most ruthless elite forensic accountant in the Southeast. I had hired David previously to uncover hidden assets during hostile corporate takeovers for my clients. I told him I needed him to drop everything else and quietly dissect the entire commercial real estate portfolio belonging to my brother-in-law. I forwarded David the forged loan documents the detective had shown me at the precinct earlier that morning. I told him to follow the digital breadcrumbs Trent had left behind. I wanted to know about every shell company, every offshore account, every single wire transfer, and every piece of property Trent had touched in the last 5 years. I authorized David to use whatever resources he needed, and told him I wanted a preliminary report before the sun came up. The rest of the day was a grueling exercise in extreme discipline. I sat in my office and methodically called every single one of my corporate clients. I reassured stakeholders, secured my contracts, and completely insulated my business from the digital circus my family was conducting online. I watched my phone light up with hundreds of notifications from the family group chat, a continuous stream of toxic accusations and guilt trips orchestrated by my parents. I did not reply to a single message. I let them exhaust themselves punching at a brick wall. They thought my silence meant I was retreating. They thought they had successfully backed me into a corner and broken my spirit. I left the office well past 9 at night and drove to my penthouse in the city. The rain had stopped, leaving the Atlanta skyline glittering against the dark sky. I stood by my floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the city I had conquered, waiting for the other shoe to drop. The call came exactly at midnight. My phone vibrated on the glass coffee table. It was David. I answered the call and asked him what he had found. David did not waste time with pleasantries. He told me the situation was significantly worse than a single forged commercial loan. He said Trent was not just running a failing real estate business. Trent was operating a massive, highly illegal Ponzi scheme, moving money between fake development projects to pay off early investors. But that was not the piece of information that made the blood freeze in my veins. David told me Trent was completely broke. He had not made a single mortgage payment on the sprawling suburban McMansion in over 6 months. The bank was already preparing to initiate foreclosure proceedings on Jada and Trent's home. But Trent had been desperate for cash to keep his investors from calling the authorities. David paused, taking a slow breath before delivering the final devastating reality. He said Trent had needed liquid capital fast, and to get it, he had secretly forged documents to take out massive second mortgages on the only other asset he had access to. Trent had secretly mortgaged Calvin and Valerie's home. He had drained every last cent of equity from my parents' house without their knowledge. The very people who had spent the entire day on the internet defending him, the parents who had screamed in my face and demanded I go to prison to protect him, were currently sitting in a house that Trent had already sold out from under them. I arrived at my office the morning after learning Trent had secretly mortgaged my parents' home. I had barely sat down at my desk when my receptionist buzzed my private line. A process server was standing in the lobby. I walked out and accepted a thick stack of legal documents. It was a formal cease and desist order alongside an emergency banking notice. Trent's legal team had officially moved to freeze my crisis management firm's operational bank accounts. They were using the fraudulent corporate guarantor documents he forged to lock up my payroll, my vendor funds, and my entire business capital. It was a desperate scorched earth tactic. Trent knew the federal authorities were circling him, so he was trying to choke off my financial resources to force me into a settlement where I would assume his debt and make the criminal charges disappear. He thought cutting off my money would break my resolve. He forgot that I deal with high-stakes corporate warfare for a living. I did not shed a tear or throw a tantrum. I immediately contacted my lead corporate counsel. We spent the next 12 hours preparing an aggressive counteroffensive. By the following afternoon, we had secured an emergency injunction hearing in federal court against the commercial bank and Trent's real estate holding company. The courtroom was cold and imposing with high mahogany-paneled walls and stark lighting. The bank's legal team sat at the opposing table, looking incredibly confident in their expensive suits. Trent's lawyers sat right next to them. Trent himself did not bother to show up, likely hiding in his mansion and letting his attorneys do the dirty work. I sat at the plaintiff's table, my spine perfectly straight, wearing a tailored navy suit. I did not look like an emotional sister embroiled in a petty family dispute. I looked exactly like the chief executive officer of a 7-figure enterprise who was about to dismantle an amateur fraudster. The bank's attorneys presented their case first. They slid the signed commercial bridge loan documents across the judge's bench, pointing to the bottom line where my name was perfectly forged. They argued that my firm was legally bound to the $250,000 debt, and that the freeze on my accounts was a standard security measure to prevent capital flight. The judge, an older woman with a severe expression, looked over the paperwork and then turned her gaze to me. She asked if I had any evidence to counter the bank's highly documented claim. I stood up slowly and buttoned my suit jacket. I told the judge that the documents were indeed signed, but they were not signed by me. My corporate counsel handed the judge a sealed folder containing the comprehensive digital forensic report compiled by the elite investigator I hired the night before. I spoke clearly and methodically, so every word echoed in the quiet courtroom. I explained that in the modern corporate world, electronic signatures leave an undeniable digital footprint. I walked the judge through the forensic evidence page by page. We had tracked the exact Internet Protocol address of the device that executed the electronic signature on the corporate guarantee. I pointed out that the address did not ping from my downtown office building. It did not ping from my secure penthouse network. The digital signature originated directly from the wireless router registered to the suburban address owned by my brother-in-law. Furthermore, the login credentials used to access the banking portal were tied to an encrypted email account that Trent had created on his personal laptop just 3 days before the loan was finalized. The timestamp on the signature matched the exact hour I was recorded on high-definition security cameras sitting in my own office miles away. I watched the color completely drain from the faces of Trent's legal team. The smug confidence they had carried into the courtroom evaporated in an instant. The bank's attorneys quickly began whispering to each other, realizing they had been duped into accepting a fraudulent application and were now dangerously close to being liable for financial damages. The judge read through the forensic report twice. The silence in the room was heavy and suffocating. When she finally looked up, her expression was furious. She did not just rule in my favor, she delivered a swift and absolute legal strike. The judge immediately ordered the bank to unfreeze all of my firm's operational accounts, citing overwhelming evidence of identity theft and corporate fraud. But she did not stop there. Seeing the blatant documented criminality in the loan application, the judge issued a devastating counter-injunction. She ordered an immediate freeze on all assets belonging to Trent's real estate holding company, pending a full federal review of his financial practices. With a single strike of her gavel, I completely paralyzed the man who had tried to destroy me. I walked out of the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom, feeling a profound sense of vindication. The air outside felt lighter. I had protected my business, my employees, and my reputation. As I stepped onto the sidewalk and pulled my keys from my purse, my phone vibrated with a message from my assistant. She had sent me a photograph of a piece of mail that had just arrived at the office via expedited courier. I opened the image on my screen and stared at it in sheer disbelief. It was a thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with gold wax. Inside was a lavish gold-foiled invitation printed on heavy cardstock. Despite the fact that he was completely broke, on the verge of a federal indictment, and facing imminent foreclosure on a home, he had secretly leveraged against my parents' retirement. My sister and her husband were throwing a party. Jada and Trent were hosting a massive baby number 3 gender reveal and vow renewal ceremony this coming weekend. The venue listed on the invitation was the most exclusive, expensive country club in the greater Atlanta area. They were blowing tens of thousands of stolen dollars to put on a theatrical display of wealth and perfect family harmony for their social circle. Right beneath the photograph of the invitation was a new text message. It was from my mother, Valerie. The tone of her message was dripping with entitlement and delusion. She demanded my mandatory attendance at the country club event. She told me I was expected to stand up in front of their elite guests, hand over a generous financial check for the new baby, and deliver a public, heartfelt apology to my sister for my toxic behavior over the past few days. She ended the message by stating that if I did not show up and play my part perfectly, I would be dead to the family forever. The sheer audacity of the gold-foiled invitation resting on my mahogany desk made my chest tighten with a cold and familiar anger. My sister and her white brother-in-law were facing imminent federal indictment and complete financial ruin. Yet they were throwing a $50,000 party at the most exclusive country club in the greater Atlanta area. I read the text message from my mother again. Valerie was demanding my mandatory attendance and a public apology. She actually believed I would stand in front of their elite social circle and beg for forgiveness after they tried to send me to federal prison to cover their own crimes. I picked up my secure office phone and called David, the forensic accountant who had uncovered Trent's massive Ponzi scheme just hours prior. I told David to look specifically into the financing for this vow renewal and gender reveal. I needed to know exactly how a man whose operational accounts I had just legally frozen was paying for imported champagne and custom floral arrangements. David did not take long to find the answer. He called me back 30 minutes later with the infuriating financial trail. Trent had taken the very last of the cash from the $250,000 loan he forged in my name and funneled it through a clean offshore account. He paid the country club entirely in advance before the judge issued the counter-injunction. It was not just a lavish party. It was a desperate and highly calculated public relations stunt. Trent had invited every single one of his private investors to the country club. He needed them to see him cutting a massive cake and kissing his pregnant wife. He needed them to see the illusion of limitless wealth so they would not panic and demand their investment money back. I was using my stolen credit to buy himself a few more weeks of freedom and to keep the federal authorities from kicking down his door. I sat back in my leather executive chair and looked out at the glittering city skyline. If this were a standard corporate crisis, I would simply forward the payment receipts to the federal investigators and let them arrest him quietly. But this was not just a corporate crisis. This was deeply personal. My family had spent 35 years treating me like a disposable asset. They had tried to destroy my business reputation and my personal freedom just to keep Jada living in a fantasy world. Confronting them at the party and causing a scene would not be enough. Yelling and crying would just make me look like the bitter and jealous sister they were claiming I was. I did not need an argument. I needed absolute and undeniable leverage. I pulled up the comprehensive financial portfolio David had sent me the night before. I scrolled down to the section detailing the massive suburban mansion Jada and Trent lived in. The bank holding their primary mortgage had initiated foreclosure proceedings because Trent had not made a payment in over 6 months. In the ruthless world of high finance, distressed debt does not just sit in a vacuum. Commercial banks often sell off defaulted mortgages at auction for pennies on the dollar just to clear the bad debt from their official books. I called my lead corporate counsel back into my office. I instructed him to contact the primary creditor immediately. I told him I wanted to purchase the distressed debt portfolio containing my sister's mortgage. My lawyer warned me it was an aggressive and highly unusual move. He reminded me that I would be personally assuming the legal burden of evicting my own pregnant sister and my niece and nephew. I looked him dead in the eye and told him to execute the purchase through my firm's private holding company. I told him I did not care what it cost or how many strings he had to pull. I wanted the deed to that property by the end of the week. The next 48 hours were a blur of intense legal negotiations and massive wire transfers. While Jada was busy posting photos of her expensive dress fittings on social media, and Valerie was leaving me daily voicemails, demanding to know what time I would be arriving at the country club to deliver my apology, my legal team was quietly executing the most ruthless financial acquisition of my entire career. I liquidated a significant portion of my personal stock portfolio to ensure the transaction was entirely cash. I wanted no delays, no bank approvals, and no contingencies. I was buying my own justice, and I was paying for it in full. By Thursday afternoon, the final electronic signatures were authenticated by the state. My lawyer walked into my office and placed a thick-bound folder directly on the center of my desk. The title transfer was officially complete. For less than 40% of the original property value, my holding company had successfully acquired the defaulted mortgage. I picked up the heavy legal document and felt a cold, sharp sense of absolute victory wash over me. I now legally owned the roof over their heads. Jada and Trent were sleeping in a house that belonged entirely to me. They were completely at my mercy, and they did not even know it yet. I was reviewing the final eviction notices my legal team had drafted when my receptionist buzzed my private line. She sounded incredibly uncomfortable and kept her voice low. She said my mother was standing in the lobby and refusing to leave until she spoke to me. Valerie had bypassed building security by tailgating a delivery worker, and she was currently making a scene in front of my employees. I did not call building security to have her thrown out. I slipped the verified mortgage documents into my leather briefcase, snapped the brass locks shut, and walked out to the reception area. Valerie was standing there in a tailored beige suit, her designer handbag clutched tightly in front of her. She looked around my pristine modern office with a mixture of open disdain and unearned entitlement. She had never once visited my firm to congratulate me on a milestone, but she was perfectly willing to show up to demand my submission. When she saw me, she did not bother saying hello or asking how my week had been. She crossed her arms and demanded to know if I had purchased the perfect baby gift for the party on Saturday. She spoke to me like a disobedient child, warning me that my gift better be generous enough to make up for all the toxic drama I had caused the family over the past few days. She said Jada was expecting a significant financial contribution to the new nursery and that a substantial check would go a long way in proving I was finally ready to be a real part of this family. I stood there and let her finish her ridiculous demands. I thought about the thousands of hours I had worked to build my life, while she drained her own retirement to fund the illusion of Trent's success. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch or show a single ounce of the pain she had inflicted on me over the years. I walked right up to her, maintaining perfect professional posture. I smiled a calm and terrifyingly polite smile that made her eyes narrow in sudden confusion. I reached down and patted the smooth leather of my briefcase. I told my mother she did not need to worry about my generosity. I looked her straight in the eye and told her I got them a piece of paper that will completely change their lives. Saturday morning arrived with a crisp, biting chill in the air. I woke up long before my alarm went off, opening my eyes to the quiet, expansive darkness of my downtown penthouse. There was no lingering anxiety in my chest. There was no trace of the heavy, suffocating dread that usually accompanied my family obligations. I felt an absolute terrifying sense of calm. Today was the day 35 years of disrespect, manipulation, and financial abuse came to a permanent, spectacular end. I walked into my master bathroom and began the meticulous process of getting dressed. I was not dressing for a joyous family celebration. I was dressing for high-stakes corporate warfare. I bypassed the muted diplomatic colors I usually wore for client meetings and selected a perfectly tailored bold crimson suit. The color was entirely intentional. It was aggressive, unapologetic, and commanded immediate attention in any room. I pulled my hair back into a sleek, flawless style that left no room for vulnerability. I applied my makeup with military precision, enhancing the sharp angles of my face. I looked at my reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirror, and I did not see the scapegoat daughter my parents had spent my entire life trying to tear down. I saw the chief executive officer of a highly lucrative crisis management firm who was about to execute the most flawless, devastating response of her entire career. Every piece of clothing, every piece of jewelry was pure, unadulterated armor. At exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, the secure line on my office desk rang. It was David, my elite forensic accountant. He confirmed that the digital trail on Trent's forged commercial loan was locked, verified, and completely undeniable. He had spent the last 48 hours handing over every single piece of financial evidence we uncovered to my contact at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Agent Sterling, a veteran investigator who had been quietly building a massive wire fraud case against Trent's real estate holding company for months, joined our encrypted conference call a few minutes later. His voice was deep, gravelly, and strictly business. He confirmed that the federal arrest warrants and asset seizure orders had been officially signed by a federal judge late Friday night. Trent had been incredibly slippery, hiding his Ponzi scheme behind a maze of shell companies and fake development projects. But the desperate, sloppy forgery of my corporate signature was the fatal mistake that finally gave the federal authorities the leverage they needed to tear his entire operation down. Agent Sterling told me his tactical team was fully briefed and ready to move. We synchronized our watches down to the exact second. I told Agent Sterling I needed exactly 20 minutes inside that country club ballroom to dismantle my family's false narrative before his agents breached the heavy oak doors. I needed the investors and my family to see the absolute truth from my own hands before the handcuffs came out. Agent Sterling agreed. High told me his federal team would be waiting in unmarked vehicles just outside the country club gates, entirely out of sight, but ready to move on my exact signal. I ended the call and walked into my kitchen to pour a cup of black coffee. As I set the carafe down, my cell phone vibrated violently against the granite countertop. I looked down at the illuminated screen. It was a text message from my sister Jada. Even on the morning of her own massive stolen party, even while living in a foreclosed home, she could not resist the overwhelming urge to try and diminish me. The message read, "I cannot wait for you to see what a real family looks like today. Do not forget your apology speech. Mom says you better have a generous check ready for the nursery if you want to be allowed in the family photos." I stared at the glowing text message. A few days ago, those entitled toxic words would have sent a spike of white-hot rage directly through my chest. Now they just felt incredibly pathetic. Jada was sitting in a suburban mansion she no longer owned, married to a man who was literally hours away from federal prison, and she was still desperately trying to play the superior golden child. She truly believed she had won. She believed her fake tears and viral internet videos had successfully backed me into a corner. I did not type out an angry defensive reply. I did not try to justify my definition of a real family or argue about her husband's crimes. I simply tapped the screen and sent back a single thumbs up emoji. It was the absolute least amount of energy I could possibly expend on her delusion. I walked back into my home office and opened my heavy steel wall safe. I pulled out the thick red legal folder that my corporate counsel had personally delivered the day before. Inside that folder was the official notarized deed and the distressed debt portfolio, proving I now legally owned Jada and Trent's sprawling McMansion. Right behind those eviction documents was the comprehensive forensic report, detailing Trent's massive Ponzi scheme, alongside the horrifying proof of the second mortgages he had secretly taken out on my parents' home. I placed the red legal folder carefully into my structured leather briefcase, snapping the brass locks shut with a satisfying click. Then I did something I had never done before attending a family event. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a small, highly discreet wireless microphone. I taped the tiny audio transmitter securely to the inside of my silk blouse, hiding it perfectly beneath the lapel of my crimson blazer. I synced the receiver directly to a secure broadcasting application on my phone. If Trent tried to lie to his investors, if Valerie tried to gaslight me in front of their elite guests, I was going to make sure every single word I said was amplified with crystal clear audio. I grabbed my briefcase, walked down to my private garage, and got into my sleek black luxury sedan. I drove out of the city and headed toward the affluent northern suburbs. The country club Jada and Trent had chosen for their gender reveal and vow renewal was notoriously exclusive. It was the kind of place where generational wealth was a strict minimum requirement for entry, and the waiting list for a basic social membership spanned over a decade. Trent had undoubtedly chosen this specific, high-status venue to project an ironclad illusion of unstoppable success to his anxious private investors. He needed them to see him pouring expensive champagne so they would not suspect he was bankrupt. As I turned onto the long, perfectly manicured driveway leading up to the massive colonial clubhouse, I saw luxury vehicles lined up for the valet service. Women in expensive pastel dresses and men in tailored seersucker suits were milling about the grand entrance, laughing and holding wrapped gifts. It was a beautiful picture-perfect facade masking a massive criminal enterprise. I pulled my car up to the front of the line right behind a silver sports car. A young valet in a crisp white uniform immediately approached my driver's side window. He leaned down with a polite, practiced smile, ready to offer me a claim ticket. But as soon as he glanced down at the restricted guest clipboard resting on his wooden podium, his entire expression changed. He shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat. He apologized profusely and stated that my vehicle make and license plate had been specifically flagged by the event organizers. He looked at me with genuine pity and told me the host of the baby shower, Mr. Trent, had left extremely strict, explicit orders with the club security not to let me onto the property under any circumstances. Trent had actually tried to have me barred from the venue while simultaneously demanding my money and a public apology. It was his ultimate power play. He thought he could publicly humiliate me one last time by forcing me to sit in my car and beg the club staff for entry while my family watched from the terrace. I did not argue with the young valet. I did not raise my voice, roll down my window to yell, or demand to speak to the general manager. I maintained perfect, unwavering eye contact. I calmly opened my center console, reached into my designer wallet, and pulled out a heavy matte black metal card. I handed it through the open window to the valet. It was a platinum membership card to this exact country club. It was a tier of membership so exclusive, so outrageously expensive, that it bypassed all private event restrictions and granted the holder absolute access to every square inch of the property. My family had spent my entire life assuming I was just a struggling, bitter workaholic who sat at a laptop all day. They had absolutely no idea I was a platinum member of the very club they were using stolen money to rent. The valet looked down at the heavy black metal card in his hand. His eyes widened in sudden absolute realization. The young valet stared at the heavy black metal card in his hand. The color instantly drained from his face. He looked from the platinum membership card back up to me, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to find the right words. I did not rush him. I simply waited while the reality of his mistake washed over him. He handed the card back with trembling fingers, bowing his head slightly, and apologized profusely. He promised me he would park my car in the VIP section immediately and personally ensure it was kept secure. I told him to take his time. I grabbed my structured leather briefcase and stepped out into the crisp morning air. I walked up the grand marble steps of the country club. The massive double doors were propped open by towering displays of imported white hydrangeas and orchids. The sheer volume of flowers alone must have cost more than the average person's annual salary. I stepped into the grand foyer, and the sound of a live string quartet drifted through the hallway, mixing with the clinking of crystal champagne flutes and the loud, arrogant laughter of men who believed they owned the world. Trent had spared absolutely no expense to maintain his illusion. He was throwing a party fit for a king while federal agents were quite literally waiting outside the gates to strip him of his crown. I pushed open the heavy oak doors leading into the main ballroom. The space was breathtakingly lavish, gold-draped tables filled the room, and an enormous custom-built dessert display sat near the stage. The room was packed with Atlanta's corporate elite, local socialites, Trent's private investors, and every single member of my extended family. For a brief moment I stood at the threshold in my bold crimson suit. I did not try to blend in. I stood with my shoulders back and my head held high. Several people turned to look at me, their conversations dying out as they took in my presence. It only took 10 seconds for my mother to spot me. Valerie was standing near the front of the room, holding court with a group of older women from her church. When she saw me, her fake practiced smile vanished instantly. She excused herself and marched straight toward me, her heels clicking aggressively against the polished hardwood floor. She grabbed my elbow, her grip tight and bruising, and tried to pull me toward a set of private doors leading to the catering kitchen. She hissed under her breath, demanding to know why I was wearing red to a pastel-themed baby shower. She told me I was deliberately trying to pull focus away from my sister. She ordered me to go into the back room with her right that second, so we could practice my public apology. She said she was not going to let me ruin Jada's special day with my bitter attitude, and she wanted to make sure I handed over the financial check for the nursery before I was allowed to eat. I looked down at her hand gripping my arm. I did not pull away violently. I simply stared at her fingers until she felt uncomfortable enough to let go. I told my mother I was not going to any back room. I told her I was not practicing a single word for her, and I was definitely not handing over a check to fund her delusions. I smoothed out the sleeve of my blazer and told her she needed to step aside. Valerie gasped, her face flushing with indignation. But before she could launch into another tirade, the string quartet suddenly stopped playing. A sharp tapping sound echoed through the massive speakers. Trent was standing on the grand stage at the front of the ballroom. Jada stood right next to him, wearing a custom maternity gown that sparkled under the stage lights. She rested both hands on her stomach, looking out at the crowd with a sickeningly sweet smile. Trent held the microphone with the easy, relaxed confidence of a man who believed he was untouchable. He thanked everyone for coming to celebrate the expansion of his beautiful family. He talked about the hard work it took to build a real estate empire, lying through his teeth to a room full of investors who had no idea their money was already gone. He spoke about the importance of legacy and building generational wealth. Then his voice took on a solemn, manufactured tone of pity. He told the crowd that building a strong family sometimes meant having to make incredibly difficult choices. He said it meant overcoming toxic negativity and cutting out the bad energy that tries to drag you down. He preached about how success breeds jealousy and how he and Jada had recently been forced to set firm boundaries against bitter, resentful people who simply could not stand to see them happy. The entire room knew exactly who he was talking about. My extended family members exchanged knowing glances. Valerie stood a few feet away from me, nodding proudly at her white son-in-law. Trent finished his speech to a round of enthusiastic applause. He looked across the sea of tables and locked eyes directly with me, standing at the back of the room. He flashed a triumphant, condescending smile. He truly believed he had won. He thought I was just going to stand there in my crimson suit and swallow the public humiliation. I did not wait for the applause to die down. I did not wait for the waitstaff to bring out the champagne toast. I turned away from his smug face and walked purposefully toward the elevated audio-visual booth set up in the back corner of the ballroom. A young technician was sitting behind the massive soundboard monitoring the audio levels. I walked right up to him, reached into my purse, and pulled out 2 crisp $100 bills. I placed the cash directly on his console and told him to take an early lunch break. The technician looked at the money, looked at my completely unyielding expression, and immediately stood up and walked away. I set my structured leather briefcase down on his chair. I opened the brass locks, reached inside, and pulled out my encrypted USB drive. Without a single second of hesitation, I plugged it directly into the main projector system. The moment I pushed the encrypted drive into the central projector system, the massive digital screens behind the stage went entirely black. The sudden darkness swallowed the pastel pink and blue baby announcement graphics that had been illuminating the ballroom. A second later, my corporate logo flashed across the screens in crisp white lettering. The sudden visual shift was so jarring that the live string quartet playing in the corner of the room fumbled their notes and ground to an awkward, echoing halt. The silence that fell over the grand ballroom was immediate and heavy. Hundreds of wealthy guests, private investors, and my entire extended family turned their heads toward the back of the room. I picked up the spare wireless microphone resting on the technician's soundboard. I switched it on. A sharp, clear feedback click resonated through the massive overhead speakers, demanding absolute attention. I did not run up to the stage. I did not yell. I did not let a single tremor of emotion enter my voice. I spoke with the chilling, measured tone of a corporate executive neutralizing an active threat. Trent likes to talk about building generational wealth, I said into the microphone. My voice echoed off the high vaulted ceiling, steady and commanding. He just gave you all a beautiful speech about cutting out toxic negativity to protect his family legacy. So let us take a very close look at exactly how he builds that wealth. I pressed the forward button on the presenter remote in my hand. The screens behind Trent transitioned instantly. The room was suddenly illuminated by a high-definition projection of a formal commercial banking document. It was blown up to massive proportions, making every single line of text legible to the people sitting all the way in the back row. I directed the crowd's attention to the top of the document, explaining exactly what they were looking at. I told them it was a bridge loan application for $250,000, filed just days ago by Trent's real estate holding company. I clicked the remote again. A bright red digital box appeared on the screen, highlighting the bottom right corner of the application. I told the room to look closely at the primary corporate guarantor section. I read the name out loud. It was my name alongside the tax identification numbers for my crisis management firm, followed by a completely forged signature. A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. The elite socialites sitting at the front tables leaned back in their gold Chiavari chairs, their eyes darting between me at the soundboard and Trent on the stage. The private investors' men in tailored suits who had poured their own capital into Trent's business suddenly sat up perfectly straight. They recognized commercial bank fraud when they saw it. Trent stood frozen on the stage. The smug, triumphant smile he had worn just moments ago completely vanished. His face drained of color, leaving him looking pale and suddenly very small. Jada dropped her hands from her pregnant stomach, her mouth opening in silent shock as she stared at my name plastered across the fraudulent loan. I did not give them a second to recover. I clicked the remote a third time. The screen split down the middle. On the left side was the forged signature. On the right side was the comprehensive digital forensic report compiled by my elite investigator. I spoke directly to the silent room, teaching a masterclass in absolute destruction. I explained that electronic signatures leave an undeniable digital footprint. I pointed to the Internet Protocol address projected on the screen. I told the crowd that the address did not match my downtown office or my penthouse. It matched the wireless router registered to the exact suburban mansion where Trent and Jada lived. I continued relentlessly. I highlighted the login credentials used to access the banking portal, showing how they were tied to an encrypted email account created on Trent's personal laptop. I told the audience that the timestamp on this forgery matched the exact hour I was recorded on high-definition security cameras sitting in my own office miles away. I looked across the sea of faces and found my mother. Valerie was standing completely rigid, her fingers digging into the edge of a catering table. I spoke clearly into the microphone, making sure she heard every single word. I announced that the man standing on the stage, the man who claimed to be the ultimate provider, had stolen my corporate identity to commit a federal crime because his real estate empire was entirely bankrupt. I told the room that he had funneled the stolen money through an offshore account to pay for the imported champagne they were currently drinking. The ballroom descended into absolute chaos. The polite, quiet murmurs turned into loud, frantic whispers. The private investors pulled out their cell phones, immediately stepping away from their tables to make urgent calls to their own financial advisors. They knew that if Trent was forging documents for $250,000, their own investments were in critical danger. Trent finally snapped out of his paralyzed state. The reality of his public execution hit him all at once. His face turned a deep, furious shade of crimson. He dropped his champagne glass, letting it shatter against the polished wooden stage. He lunged toward the edge of the stage, pointing a shaking finger at me across the room. He screamed into his own microphone, his voice cracking with pure panic. He yelled that I was a bitter, jealous liar. He told the crowd not to listen to me, claiming the documents were fabricated, and that I was a mentally unstable woman trying to ruin his life because I was obsessed with his success. He jumped down from the stage and started marching down the center aisle directly toward the audio-visual booth, his fists clenched at his sides. Jada started crying, gripping the microphone stand on the stage and begging the crowd to ignore me. She yelled that I was just trying to steal her joy on her special day. I did not back away. I did not call for security. I stood my ground, watching Trent stomp toward me like a cornered animal. When he reached the booth, he reached out violently, trying to snatch the microphone out of my hand. I sidestepped him with effortless grace, letting his momentum carry him forward until he stumbled against the soundboard. I looked at him with absolute freezing contempt. I told him he was making a terrible scene in front of his investors. I raised the microphone back to my mouth and looked past Trent, directing my gaze straight at my father. Calvin was standing near the front, looking utterly bewildered and terrified as his pristine family image crumbled in real time. I told the room that Trent was right about one thing. I told them we needed to talk about building a legacy and protecting the family. I raised the presenter remote in my hand. I told them that forging my signature to steal from a bank was only the beginning of what Trent had done to keep his illusion alive. I pressed the forward button one more time. The screen flashed, bringing up a new set of highly classified financial documents. I watched my parents look up at the projection, their eyes widening as they recognized their own names and their own home address, displayed in massive letters for the entire city elite to see. I pressed the button on the remote, and the massive digital screens behind the stage shifted instantly. The forged commercial loan application vanished into the dark background of the projection. In its place, a series of highly classified banking documents materialized in bright, glaring white. I had instructed my forensic accountant to highlight the most devastating lines in thick yellow marker, so there could be absolutely no confusion about what the crowd was looking at. The documents were official property deeds and monthly banking statements, but they did not belong to Trent or his failing real estate company. They belonged to my parents. I looked down into the sea of upturned faces and locked my gaze directly onto my father. Calvin was standing near the front row, his broad shoulders stiff, his expression a mixture of deep confusion and mounting dread. Valerie stood right beside him, her perfectly manicured hand hovering near her throat. They were staring at their own home address projected in massive bold letters across the country club ballroom. Below their address was a detailed, meticulous breakdown of their personal financial accounts and retirement portfolios. The room went dead silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy enough to crush the breath right out of your lungs. I raised the microphone to my lips. My voice was completely steady, lacking any trace of the desperate daughter they had tried to manipulate and isolate just days ago. I told my parents to look very closely at the dates stamped at the top of the banking forms. I told them to read the exact dollar amounts that had been authorized and withdrawn from their personal accounts over the past 6 months. I spoke clearly, ensuring every single guest, socialite, and investor in the room heard exactly how the golden couple operated behind closed doors. I told Calvin and Valerie that the man standing next to the soundboard, the white knight they had chosen to protect and elevate above their own flesh and blood, had not just tried to commit federal corporate fraud against my crisis management firm. I told them Trent had been incredibly busy while they were busy defending him on the internet and orchestrating a smear campaign against me. I pointed to the left side of the large screen and explained that Trent had completely liquidated their entire retirement savings. Every single penny Calvin had worked for during his long career, every dollar Valerie had tucked away for their golden years had been drained through a series of unauthorized wire transfers. Then I pointed to the right side of the screen where the property records were displayed in stark, unarguable detail. I told my parents that Trent did not stop at stealing their cash savings. He was so desperate to keep his failing business afloat and to fund his lavish lifestyle that he had secretly taken out massive second mortgages on their family home. He had leveraged the very roof over their heads to pay off his angry creditors and to fund the imported champagne they were currently holding in their hands. The realization hit my parents like a physical blow. Valerie let out a sound that was half gasp and half sob. Her fingers went entirely slack. The crystal champagne flute she had been holding slipped from her grip and hit the polished hardwood floor. The sound of the fragile glass shattering echoed like a gunshot through the silent ballroom. The expensive champagne splashed across the hem of her designer dress and ruined her expensive shoes, but she did not even notice. She just stood there staring up at the screen, her face completely drained of color as the reality of her total financial ruin washed over her. Beside her, Calvin physically collapsed. The booming, authoritative patriarch who had threatened to write me out of his will just days ago suddenly lost all the strength in his legs. His knees gave out completely. He stumbled forward, knocking into a gold-draped catering table to keep himself from hitting the floor. He gripped the edge of the table, his chest heaving as he stared at the zero balance on his life savings. They had drained their original accounts to pay for Jada's extravagant wedding years ago. They had given Trent everything they had to secure their social status in the community. And now they were staring at the undeniable proof that the man they worshipped had stolen whatever was left and mortgaged their future to buy himself a few more weeks of freedom. On the stage, Jada finally broke out of her paralyzed state. She turned around to look at the massive screens, and then she looked down at our parents, holding onto the catering table for dear life. The perfect illusion of her flawless, wealthy existence shattered in real time. She realized that the $50,000 party she was currently hosting, the custom maternity gown she was wearing, and the lavish lifestyle she had been bragging about on social media were all funded by the complete destruction of our parents' financial security. Jada dropped her microphone. It hit the stage floor with a loud, piercing squeal of feedback that made people in the front row cover their ears. She turned her attention away from me and lunged toward the edge of the stage, screaming at her husband. She demanded to know if the documents on the screen were real. She screamed at Trent, asking him where the money went and why he had mortgaged their parents' house without telling her. Her fake tears from the internet videos were entirely gone, replaced by raw, unfiltered panic. She was not crying because she felt sorry for our parents. She was crying because her whole identity was wrapped up in being wealthy, and she knew the money was gone. She was terrified of losing her status in front of the Atlanta elite. She realized she was married to a man who had left her with absolutely nothing but debt and public humiliation. Trent realized he was losing control of the room entirely. His own wife was screaming at him from the stage while guests recorded the meltdown on their phones. His in-laws were collapsing in the front row. and his private investors were staring at him with undisguised fury. He backed away from the audiovisual booth and turned toward the crowd, throwing his hands up in a desperate, placating gesture. He raised his voice, trying to project the smooth, confident persona he had used to swindle them in the first place. He yelled out to the investors, claiming that this was all a massive misunderstanding blown completely out of proportion. He told them it was just a temporary cash flow issue, a minor restructuring of assets that his accountants were handling perfectly. He pointed at me and screamed that I was twisting the documents out of context because I was trying to destroy his family out of spite. He begged the wealthy men in tailored suits to trust him, promising them that their development projects were secure and that their money was perfectly safe in escrow. He swore he was on the verge of closing a massive commercial deal that would double their returns by the end of the quarter. I took a few steps toward the nearest table of investors, but they actively stepped back away from him. He was lying through his teeth and sweating profusely, practically begging them not to walk out the doors and abandon him. I did not let him finish his pathetic sales pitch. I stood in the audiovisual booth, completely untouched by the chaos erupting below me. I picked up the presenter remote and looked directly at the group of private investors who were clutching their cell phones and glaring at Trent. I spoke into the microphone, my voice slicing right through his desperate lies. I told the investors that Trent was not restructuring assets, and he was definitely not closing any commercial deals anytime soon. I told them they needed to look at the screen one last time before they decided to trust a man who steals the retirement funds from his own family to pay for party decorations. I pressed the forward button and advanced to the final slide of my presentation. The screen flashed bright white, displaying a highly classified, heavily redacted federal document my investigator had secured just hours ago. It was a formal notice of an active investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission into Trent's real estate holding company. The document explicitly detailed a multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme and listed multiple counts of severe financial fraud. The ballroom erupted into absolute pandemonium. The investors did not wait for another explanation from Trent. They pulled out their phones, making frantic, terrified calls to their lawyers and financial advisors, scrambling to salvage whatever was left of their money before the government froze everything they owned. Total chaos erupted across the grand ballroom. The perfectly curated illusion of wealth and family unity was instantly reduced to absolute rubble. The wealthy private investors who had treated Trent like a financial genius just an hour ago were now rushing toward the exit doors in a blind panic. They bumped into gold-draped tables and knocked over towering crystal centerpieces in their desperate hurry to escape the sinking ship. I watched grown men in expensive tailored suits, sprinting out of the room with their cell phones pressed tightly to their ears, scrambling to salvage whatever was left of their money before the federal government froze their entire portfolios. Waitstaff stood frozen against the floral-decorated walls, unsure if they should continue pouring imported champagne or clear the room entirely. The live string quartet had completely abandoned their instruments and slipped out the side doors, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating silence that was only broken by the frantic murmurs of the remaining guests. I stood perfectly still in the elevated audio-visual booth, watching the devastation unfold with absolute clarity. The extended family members who had spent the entire week flooding my personal phone with hateful voicemails and vicious text messages were now shrinking back into the shadows. My aunts and uncles, the very same people who had blindly believed Jada's viral internet video and called me a toxic, career-obsessed monster, could not even look in my direction. Just yesterday, they were leaving messages calling me a disgrace for supposedly threatening a pregnant woman. They had rallied behind a charismatic white man who promised them proximity to elite power, and they had viciously attacked the successful black woman who had actually built her own empire from scratch. Now they were watching that same man exposed as a desperate criminal who had just financially ruined their own brother and sister. They stared down at the polished hardwood floor or turned their backs, completely ashamed. The hypocrisy in the room was thick enough to choke on, and I let them sit in their crushing guilt. Through the panicked, dispersing crowd, I saw my sister pushing her way toward the back of the room. Jada was practically tripping over the long hem of her custom maternity gown. Her face was streaked with running makeup, and her eyes were wide with a frantic, calculating energy. For a brief second, I expected her to run to our parents to comfort the people whose life savings had just been decimated to pay for the ridiculous party she was hosting. I thought she might drop to her knees and apologize to Calvin and Valerie for bringing a thief into their lives. But Jada did not even glance at our parents, who were still slumped against the catering table in the front row. She marched straight down the center aisle, stepping right past their financial ruin, and headed directly toward me. She reached the audio-visual booth and slammed her hands down hard on the control board. She did not apologize for filing a false police report against me. She did not express a single ounce of remorse for the stolen money or the vicious lies she had spread to my corporate clients. Instead, she looked at me with pure entitled rage and demanded that I fix the situation immediately. She ordered me to use my crisis management firm to spin the story. She told me to draft an official press release claiming the federal investigation was just a clerical banking error. She actually told me to go back on the microphone and tell the room that I really did sign the commercial loan so Trent would not go to jail. She demanded I use my high-powered corporate contacts to call off the media and save her husband from federal prison because she refused to be embarrassed in front of Atlanta high society. She said I owed it to her unborn baby to clean up this mess. I looked at my younger sister and felt a profound, overwhelming sense of closure. For 35 years, I had been conditioned to clean up her messes, to step aside so she could shine, and to take the blame whenever her poor choices caught up with her. She truly believed that no matter how horribly she treated me, I would always default to being the reliable scapegoat and the unpaid servant. She thought the bond of sisterhood meant I was permanently obligated to protect her from the consequences of her own malicious actions. She thought I would sacrifice my freedom just to keep her comfortable. I kept my voice incredibly calm, making sure the wireless microphone clipped under my crimson blazer picked up every single word. I told Jada I did not come to the country club to do her public relations. I reached into my structured leather briefcase and pulled out the thick red legal folder my corporate counsel had personally delivered the day before. I placed the bright red folder squarely on top of the soundboard right over her trembling hands. I told her I came to deliver her formal eviction notice. Jada snatched her hands back and stared at the red folder as if it were burning hot. She shook her head, trying to deny what was happening. I opened the folder and turned the verified property deed around so she could read the bold print. I explained the reality of her situation very slowly so she would not miss a single detail. I told her that Trent had not paid the mortgage on their massive suburban mansion in over 6 months. I told her the bank had initiated foreclosure proceedings and put their distressed debt portfolio up for a private commercial auction. I looked her dead in the eye and told her I purchased that defaulted mortgage yesterday morning with pure cash. I told my sister I now legally owned the roof over her head. I told her she had exactly 24 hours to pack her bags and vacate my property before I called the sheriff's department to have her physically removed. The words hit Jada with the force of a speeding freight train. The delusion she had been clinging to completely evaporated in an instant. She realized she was not just losing her social status or her fabricated wealth. She was losing her home to the exact sister she had tried to destroy on the internet. Jada let out a piercing guttural scream that echoed through the entire ballroom. She collapsed to the polished hardwood floor, falling hard onto her knees. She began sobbing hysterically, clutching the fabric of her expensive designer maternity dress and wailing that her life was ruined. She rocked back and forth on the floor, throwing a massive theatrical tantrum right in front of the remaining guests. But this time she did not have a camera to record it, and she did not have a fabricated story to make herself the sympathetic victim. She was just a cruel, spoiled woman, facing the absolute ruin she had built for herself. Trent saw his wife collapse from the stage. He realized in that exact moment that he had lost absolutely everything. His elite investors were gone. His money was completely gone, and his massive suburban house belonged to the black woman he had tried to frame for corporate fraud. The smooth, charming real estate developer persona completely melted away, leaving nothing but a cornered, desperate, and incredibly violent animal. Trent sprinted down the main aisle toward the audio-visual booth, his face contorted with pure, uncontrollable hatred. He lunged over the control board, his eyes wild, and grabbed my left arm violently. His heavy fingers dug deeply into my skin, his grip tight enough to leave dark bruises. I could smell the stale sweat and absolute panic radiating off him. He pulled me toward him, gritting his teeth and screaming right into my face. He threatened to destroy me. He swore he would tear my business to the ground and make me pay for humiliating him in front of his powerful friends. He raised his other hand, looking like he was about to strike me right there in the booth. I did not flinch. I did not pull away or show a single ounce of the fear he was so desperately trying to provoke. I stood my ground, staring right back into his panicked eyes, refusing to give him any power over me. I knew my private security detail was moving in rapidly from the perimeter of the room to intercept him. But before my guards could even lay a hand on his shoulder, a loud booming crash echoed through the silent room. The massive heavy oak doors at the main entrance of the grand ballroom swung violently open. The heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom swung violently inward, slamming against the paneled walls with a force that made the crystal chandeliers rattle above our heads. The sheer physical power of the entrance immediately paralyzed every single person left in the room. Trent froze, his heavy fingers still digging painfully into my left arm. His furious, heavy breathing suddenly suspended. The aggressive cornered animal persona he had just projected completely vanished, replaced in an instant by the stark, undeniable terror of a man who realized there was absolutely nowhere left to run. 6 men and women in dark tailored windbreakers marched through the threshold. They did not look like private country club security guards or local police officers responding to a noise complaint. They moved with absolute synchronized authority. The bright yellow lettering across the back of their jackets identified them as federal agents. They did not care about the shattered champagne glasses on the polished hardwood floor. They did not care about the extravagant pastel balloon arches or the elite socialites huddled in the corners of the room. They had a singular, undeniable target, and they moved toward the audiovisual booth with terrifying precision. The lead federal agent walked straight down the center aisle, his eyes locked entirely on Trent. He did not ask for permission to approach the booth. Trent let go of my arm as if he had been physically burned. He stumbled backward, his hands rising defensively in the air, his arrogant commercial real estate developer facade completely disintegrating into raw, unfiltered panic. 2 agents flanked him immediately. They grabbed his arms with practiced efficiency, forcing them firmly behind his back. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoing through the silent ballroom was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard in my entire life. The lead agent spoke with a volume and clarity that ensured the entire room heard every single word of the arrest. He formally placed Trent under arrest for multiple federal charges, citing wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and operating a multi-million-dollar financial pyramid scheme across state lines. The agent began reciting Trent's Miranda rights in a flat, clinical tone that completely stripped away any remaining illusion of a misunderstanding. Jada, who was still slumped on the floor in her ruined designer maternity gown, let out a horrific, guttural scream. The sound tore through the quiet room, filled with a frantic, desperate delusion. She scrambled to her feet, her high heels slipping dangerously on the polished floor, and ran toward the back of the room. She grabbed the lead agent's arm, sobbing hysterically, begging him to stop and screaming that there had to be some kind of terrible clerical mistake. She demanded that they unhand her husband, immediately screaming to the federal authorities that Trent was a successful, legitimate businessman who was just closing a massive corporate deal. The agents ignored her entirely. They expertly shielded Trent and continued physically guiding him away from the booth. When Jada realized her tears and theatrical outrage had absolutely no effect on federal law enforcement, she turned her frantic, tear-streaked face toward the front row. She looked desperately at our father. Jada screamed for Calvin to do something. She begged him to use his influence in the community, demanding he call a high-powered defense lawyer or pay whatever massive cash bail was necessary to stop the federal government from taking her husband away. She truly believed her father would swoop in and fix the disaster just like he had always done for her in the past. But Calvin could not move. He was completely paralyzed. He was still gripping the edge of the gold-draped catering table, his knuckles bone-white, his eyes glued to the massive digital screen I had projected just moments before. I was staring at the undeniable permanent proof of his zeroed-out life savings and the secret second mortgages placed on his family home. He was a broken, hollow shell of a man who had just realized he sacrificed his own financial survival and alienated his only truly successful daughter to fund a brazen criminal. The legacy and social reputation he prized above all else had been completely annihilated by his own blind favoritism. He did not even blink when Jada screamed his name. He did not reach out to comfort his golden child. He had absolutely nothing left to give her. Trent was physically escorted down the center aisle, completely surrounded by the federal sweep team. The elite private investors who had not already fled the room watched him with pure, undisguised disgust. The socialites who had praised his generosity just an hour ago now whispered viciously behind their hands, actively stepping away from the aisle so his jacket would not brush against them. Trent kept his head down, his face flushed with the ultimate, inescapable humiliation of being dragged out of his own $50,000 party in handcuffs. He was stripped of his dignity, his power, and his freedom right in front of every single person he had ever tried to impress. I watched the heavy oak doors close behind him, securing his transition from a fraudulent king to a federal inmate. As the doors shut, leaving the ballroom in a state of stunned, breathless shock, the country club general manager stepped cautiously into the room. He looked incredibly pale, holding a leather payment folder in his trembling hands. He walked past the crying, hysterical figure of my sister and approached Valerie, who was still standing frozen near the front row beside her catatonic husband. The manager cleared his throat nervously, his professional demeanor cracking under the immense financial anxiety of the moment. He informed my mother that the federal authorities had just placed an immediate comprehensive freeze on all of Trent's financial and corporate assets. He stated, his voice carrying through the quiet room, that the credit card Trent had used to reserve the exclusive venue and pay for the lavish $50,000 catering package had just been officially declined by the federal government. The payment had bounced, leaving a massive unpaid invoice for an event that was currently in ruins. Valerie stared at the general manager, her face a mask of absolute horror. She did not have the money to cover a $50,000 bill. Her retirement was gone. Her home equity was gone. She was standing in a room full of her wealthy peers, completely exposed as a woman with no remaining resources. Slowly, desperately, Valerie turned her head and looked directly at me standing in the audio-visual booth. The country club manager followed her gaze. He looked up at me with a desperate, pleading expression, hoping the wealthy crisis management executive would simply open her designer purse and make the massive financial problem go away. Jada stopped crying for just a fraction of a second, looking up at me with the exact same pathetic, entitled expectation. Despite everything that had just happened, despite the fact that I had just proved Trent tried to steal my identity and ruin my life, they truly believed I would bail them out one last time to save the family from public disgrace. They still thought their social embarrassment was my responsibility to manage. I looked at the people who had spent my entire life trying to tear me down. I looked at the mother who had called me a jealous, bitter spinster on a live morning broadcast, and the sister who had tried to frame me for grand theft just to protect her illusion of superiority. I looked at the father who had threatened to write me out of his will if I did not become their unpaid servant. I did not pull out my platinum membership card. I did not open my checkbook. I did not offer a single word of comfort. I simply adjusted the collar of my bold crimson blazer, picked up my structured leather briefcase, and stepped out of the booth. I walked down the short flight of stairs and stopped right in front of the general manager. I looked him dead in the eye and told him I was not responsible for the debts of federal criminals or the deeply misguided people who chose to enable them. I turned away from my family and walked straight down the center aisle. My heels clicked rhythmically against the polished hardwood floor, a steady, triumphant march through the wreckage of their false empire. I did not look back at Jada weeping on the floor or Valerie standing paralyzed in shock. I walked right out of the ballroom, leaving them to drown in the exact mess they had created for themselves. The cool evening air hit my face the second I stepped out from under the heavy oak doors of the country club. The chaotic, suffocating energy of the grand ballroom faded behind me, muffled by the thick walls of the elite establishment. I walked down the wide marble steps and stood under the sprawling, dimly lit portico. My sleek black luxury sedan was already pulling up to the curb. The young valet who had tried to deny me entry earlier was now holding my car door open with the utmost respect. He kept his eyes lowered, clearly aware that the glamorous party inside had just devolved into a federal crime scene. I took a deep, steadying breath, my lungs filled with the crisp, clean air. For 35 years, my family had been a heavy, invisible chain wrapped tightly around my neck. They had demanded my money, my time, and my submission. They had actively conspired to send me to federal prison just to protect a man who saw us all as nothing more than disposable bank accounts. Now, standing under the soft glow of the portico lights, that chain was completely shattered. I felt an absolute, profound sense of weightlessness. I had protected my corporate firm, secured my financial assets, and delivered a permanent, undeniable reckoning. I reached into my designer purse to hand the valet a generous cash tip, but before my fingers could even touch the leather of my wallet, the heavy doors of the clubhouse burst open behind me. The sound of frantic, rushing footsteps echoed loudly against the stone pillars. I did not flinch or rush to get inside my vehicle. I turned around slowly, my posture perfectly straight, my expression entirely unreadable. Valerie, Calvin, and Jada were practically sprinting out of the lobby. The picture-perfect wealthy family facade they had spent the entire morning obsessively crafting was completely obliterated. My mother, Valerie, was stumbling in her expensive designer heels. The hem of her custom pastel dress was stained with the champagne she had dropped when she realized her life savings were gone. Her immaculate makeup was ruined, dark streaks of mascara running down her flushed, terrified face. Calvin walked heavily beside her. His shoulders slumped, his chest heaving with exertion. He looked like he had aged 20 years in the span of 20 minutes. Jada trailed right behind them, clutching her pregnant stomach, her custom maternity gown torn at the seam from when she collapsed in hysterics on the ballroom floor. The arrogant, condescending smirks they had worn while sitting at the anniversary dinner just a week ago were entirely gone. The vicious, entitled anger they had directed at me in my office was nowhere to be found. They looked broken. They looked completely, utterly desperate. They surrounded me on the portico, practically blocking my path to the open car door. The valet took a hesitant step back, his eyes wide as he watched the elite family completely break down in public. Valerie spoke first. Her voice was not booming or commanding. It was a pathetic, shaking whimper. She reached out with trembling hands, trying to grab the sleeve of my bold crimson blazer. I took a deliberate step backward, refusing to let her touch me. She dropped her hands, sobbing openly. She told me the country club manager had just threatened to call the local police if they did not provide a valid credit card to cover the $50,000 catering bill. She said her bank accounts were completely frozen, her credit was decimated, and Trent had left them with absolutely nothing. Then she looked up at me with wide, pleading eyes and made the most audacious request I had ever heard in my entire life. My mother begged me to let her and Calvin move into my downtown penthouse. She cried that the bank would be foreclosing on their family home any day now because of the secret second mortgages Trent had taken out. She said they had nowhere else to go. She promised she would not complain about my work hours. She promised she would keep the penthouse clean. She stood under the portico of a country club she could no longer afford and begged the daughter she had treated like a scapegoat to become her permanent savior. I stared at Valerie, letting the sheer, unadulterated entitlement of her request hang in the cold night air. She had spent my entire life belittling my business, calling my crisis management firm a silly internet hobby, and telling her social circle that I was a bitter, toxic spinster. She had literally stood in front of Trent just days ago, screaming in my face that I was trying to ruin an innocent white man out of pure jealousy. Now, facing the brutal consequences of her own blind favoritism, she wanted to sleep in the spare bedroom of the penthouse my silly internet hobby had paid for. Before I could even process a response to Valerie's delusion, Calvin stepped forward. He did not apologize for threatening to write me out of his will. He did not express a single ounce of remorse for believing Trent's lies over his own flesh and blood. Instead, my father looked at me with a desperate, frantic energy and pleaded for me to use my corporate power to save the man who had just destroyed him. Calvin begged me to call my elite legal team. He pleaded with me to use my wealth to hire a high-powered federal defense attorney for Trent. He actually said that Trent just made a severe mistake under the pressure of the real estate market. My father looked me dead in the eye. and said that Trent was still the father of his grandchildren, that he was still a part of this family, and that we could not let a good man rot in federal prison over a financial misunderstanding. I felt a cold, sharp spike of absolute disgust pierce my chest. Even now, stripped of his entire retirement and humiliated in front of his peers, Calvin was still protecting the white son-in-law who had robbed him blind. He was still demanding that the successful black daughter sacrifice her resources, her money, and her corporate influence to shield a criminal from the consequences of his own actions. He cared more about maintaining the illusion of Trent's superiority than he cared about the fact that Trent had actively tried to frame me for grand theft. I looked at Calvin and told him exactly what I thought of his request. I told him Trent was not a good man who made a mistake. I told him Trent was a predator who looked at our family and saw nothing but a collection of easy, gullible targets. I told Calvin that if he wanted to drain whatever pennies he had left to hire a lawyer for the man who stole his house, he could do it himself. Jada pushed her way between our parents, her face red and blotchy from crying. She did not ask about Trent's legal defense. She did not care about our parents losing their retirement. Jada only cared about one thing, her own comfort. She looked at me with a mixture of desperate panic and deeply ingrained arrogance. She acknowledged that I had purchased the defaulted mortgage from the primary creditor. She knew I now held the legal deed to the sprawling suburban mansion she lived in. Jada demanded that I let her stay in the house. She did not ask politely. She did not offer to pay rent. She cried that she was pregnant with her third child, and that the stress of a sudden eviction would be catastrophic for her health. She stepped closer to me, pointing a shaking finger at my chest, and told me that I owed her this. She actually said that because I was wealthy and single, I had a moral obligation to provide free housing for her and her children. She screamed that a real sister would never put a pregnant woman on the street, totally ignoring the fact that just 48 hours ago, she had filed a false police report trying to send me to a federal penitentiary. They stood there in a tight, desperate semicircle. Valerie weeping for my penthouse. Calvin begging for a lawyer to save his fraudulent son-in-law. Jada demanding free real estate to maintain her fake influencer lifestyle. They were a perfect tragic monument to their own toxic delusion. They genuinely believed that family loyalty meant I was permanently chained to their endless cycle of disaster. They thought 35 years of emotional conditioning would automatically kick in, that I would sigh open my checkbook and clean up the catastrophic mess they had made. I looked at the three people who had spent my entire life treating me like an unpaid servant, a financial backup plan, and an emotional punching bag. I did not yell at them. I did not list out the decades of grievances or demand the apologies I knew they were completely incapable of giving. I did not waste another drop of my energy trying to make them understand the gravity of what they had done. I simply reached inside the pocket of my bold crimson blazer. I pulled out a single crisp business card. I held it out in the quiet night air. Valerie snatched the card from my fingers, her eyes wide with sudden, desperate hope. She thought it was the direct phone number to my personal wealth manager. She thought it was the contact information for the elite legal team Calvin had just begged for. I watched her eyes scan the text printed on the card. I watched the brief, desperate hope on her face curdle into absolute terrifying realization. I watched my mother's eyes dart across the crisp white cardstock in her trembling hand. She had snatched it from my fingers with such desperate feral hope, completely convinced I was handing her the direct phone number to my private wealth manager or the contact information for a high-powered federal defense attorney. I watched her perfectly manicured thumb brush over the plain black ink. I watched the frantic expectation on her face curdle into absolute terrifying realization. The card was not embossed with gold foil. It did not carry the logo of a prestigious downtown law firm or an elite financial institution. It was a standard government-issued business card. Valerie stared at the block letters, her mouth opening and closing in silent shock. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and sudden mounting horror. Her voice shook violently when she finally managed to speak, reading the words aloud as if her brain simply refused to process them. She read the words Fulton County Public Defender's Office. I maintained perfect, unwavering eye contact. I did not smile, and I did not flinch. I kept my voice incredibly calm, delivering my words with the precise detached authority of a corporate executive finalizing a hostile termination. I told them that was the direct extension for the duty attorney at the federal courthouse. I calmly explained that since Trent had completely liquidated their retirement savings, drained his own corporate accounts, and bounced a $50,000 catering check, they were entirely destitute. They no longer had the financial liquidity to retain private legal counsel. I told my mother that her white knight was going to have to rely on a court-appointed lawyer to defend him against a mountain of federal wire fraud charges. Valerie gasped, clutching the card to her chest, as if the reality of it physically burned her. Calvin stepped forward, his face flushing a deep, furious shade of red. He puffed out his chest, trying to summon the booming, authoritative patriarch persona he had used to intimidate me my entire life. He demanded to know how I could be so incredibly insulting. He asked how I could stand there and offer a public defender to a man of Trent's caliber. He yelled that this was a mockery of our family name and a deliberate attempt to humiliate them when they were at their lowest point. I did not back down. I stepped directly into his space, forcing him to look up slightly to meet my gaze. I told my father he had already humiliated himself. I reminded him that just a few hours ago he was perfectly willing to let me take the fall for a massive commercial forgery to protect his precious family reputation. I told Calvin he had worshipped a criminal who viewed him as nothing more than a disposable ATM. I told him he did not have a family name left to protect, and that a public defender was exactly what Trent deserved. Jada let out a sharp, hysterical sob. She pushed past our father and lunged toward me, her eyes wild with panic. She demanded to know what she was supposed to do about housing. She screamed that the bank was foreclosing on her mansion, her husband was on his way to a holding cell, and she was pregnant with her third child. She demanded I hand over the keys to my downtown penthouse or let her stay in the foreclosed house I had just purchased. I looked at my sister, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical sense of finality. I told Jada to flip the public defender's business card over. With shaking hands, Jada snatched the card from our mother's grip and turned it around. On the back of the card, printed in neat, legible handwriting, was a short list of addresses. I told her it was a list of affordable two-bedroom apartment complexes in the outer suburbs that accepted tenants with poor credit histories. I looked at the three of them standing shoulder to shoulder under the dim lights of the country club portico. They were completely stripped of their false wealth, their unearned arrogance, and their toxic delusions. I told them calmly that they had spent the entire week demanding I handle the mess Trent had created. I looked directly at my mother and said, "You wanted me to handle the mess. Consider it handled." I turned my back on them and walked toward my waiting luxury sedan. The young valet stood frozen by the open driver's side door, his eyes wide as he witnessed the absolute destruction of an elite Atlanta family. I handed him a $100 bill, thanked him for keeping my car secure, and reached for the door handle. Before I could pull the heavy door open, Jada charged across the pavement. She slammed her body against the side of my car, physically blocking me from getting inside. The sheer desperation in her movements was pathetic. She grabbed the lapel of my crimson blazer, her nails digging into the silk fabric, and started screaming at the top of her lungs. She yelled that I was a monster. She screamed that I was tearing the family apart out of pure, bitter jealousy. She cried that a real sister would never leave a pregnant woman standing on the curb with nothing. She demanded I open my checkbook, demanding I fix her life, repeating over and over that we were blood and that I owed her my protection. I did not raise my hand to strike her. I did not yell back or try to match her frantic, hysterical energy. I simply reached up and pried her fingers off my blazer, peeling her grip away with cold, undeniable strength. I pushed her hands back toward her own chest and stepped into her personal space, backing her up against the frame of my car. I looked her dead in the eye. I stripped away every single ounce of sisterly obligation and familial guilt I had been carrying for 35 years. I told Jada she had never, not for a single second of her entire life, seen me as her family. I told her she only ever saw me as an asset. I was a free babysitter, a scapegoat for her mistakes, and a deep pocket she expected to pick whenever her own choices blew up in her face. I kept my voice low, dangerous, and completely final. I said you saw me as an asset, and today the asset froze. Jada's mouth opened but no sound came out. The absolute unyielding truth of my words hit her with a physical force. She realized in that exact moment that the emotional manipulation she had relied on her entire life had completely lost its power. She took a slow, trembling step backward, her hands falling limply to her sides. I did not wait for her to formulate another excuse. I opened my car door, slid into the plush leather driver's seat, and pulled the door shut with a solid, definitive thud. The thick, soundproof glass immediately cut off the chaotic noise of the country club and the frantic sobbing of my mother. I pressed the ignition button and the engine roared to life with a smooth, powerful hum. I shifted the car into drive and slowly pulled away from the curb. The sky above Atlanta finally broke open, and a cold, heavy rain began to fall. The droplets hit my windshield, washing away the dust of the day. I glanced up into my rearview mirror as I drove down the manicured, winding driveway of the elite establishment. I watched them shrinking into the distance. Valerie, Calvin, and Jada were standing together under the edge of the portico, completely exposed to the cold wind and the driving rain. Their expensive clothes were getting soaked. Their perfect hair was ruined. The valets and club staff were actively ignoring them, pretending they did not exist now that their credit cards were declined and their patriarch was in federal custody. They were completely stripped of their wealth, their status, and their illusions. They had built an entire empire on a foundation of lies, cruelty, and stolen money, and I had just detonated the very ground they stood on. I turned my car out onto the main highway, leaving the affluent suburbs entirely behind me. The rain battered against the roof of my car, but inside the cabin it was perfectly warm and quiet. I drove toward the glittering lights of the downtown skyline, heading back to the life I had built with my own two hands. I did not feel a single drop of guilt. I did not feel a trace of regret or a lingering desire for their apology. For 35 years, I had believed that if I just worked hard enough, if I was just successful enough, my family would finally respect me. I had waited for validation from people who were fundamentally incapable of offering it. I had let them define my worth, outline my responsibilities, and treat my independence as a threat. But watching them stand in the rain, clutching a public defender's business card and a list of cheap apartments, I realized I never needed their respect. I only needed my own. I had walked into that country club as a scapegoat, and I was driving away as an absolute conqueror. I had protected my crisis management firm from a catastrophic federal fraud. I had legally acquired the very real estate they used to project their superiority. I had handed their golden boy over to the federal authorities on a silver platter. I had balanced the scales of justice with a ruthless, calculated precision that left no room for debate. The road ahead of me was completely clear. I gripped the leather steering wheel, pressed my foot down on the accelerator, and drove into my future utterly and permanently free. 6 months passed since the night I drove away from the country club. The humid Atlanta summer eventually surrendered to a crisp and quiet autumn. The changing of the seasons perfectly mirrored the complete shift in my reality. For the first time in 35 years, I woke up every single morning without a heavy weight resting on my chest. I did not have any missed calls from my mother demanding my time. I did not have any passive-aggressive text messages from my sister expecting me to fund her lifestyle. The absolute silence from my biological family was not lonely. It was the most beautiful and profound peace I had ever experienced. The federal justice system moved with a swift and brutal efficiency when dealing with massive financial fraud. Trent's high-status connections and country club friends did absolutely nothing to save him. The very men he used to play golf with were the primary witnesses who testified against him. Trent was formally convicted of multiple counts of wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and operating a multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme. The judge did not show him a single ounce of leniency. I was sentenced to a lengthy term in a federal penitentiary. The arrogant commercial real estate developer who had stood in my kitchen and threatened to destroy my corporate firm was now wearing a standard-issue prison uniform. His fake empire had evaporated, leaving him with nothing but a concrete cell and the terrifying reality of his own actions. The fallout for my parents was equally devastating. Calvin and Valerie had spent decades building an identity based entirely on social superiority and financial posturing. They had sacrificed their relationship with me to protect the illusion of their perfect family. But when Trent drained their retirement accounts and secretly mortgaged their property, they were left with absolutely zero safety nets. The bank officially foreclosed on their pristine suburban home. They were forced to pack whatever belongings they had left and move into a small, outdated rental apartment on the outskirts of the city. The social community they had lorded over for years completely turned their backs on them. The elite church members and affluent neighbors refused to return their calls. The people who had once attended their lavish dinner parties were the exact same people Trent had defrauded. Calvin and Valerie became total outcasts in Atlanta society. They lost the country club memberships, the designer clothes, and the respect of their peers. They were forced to live out their golden years in total isolation, surrounded by the bitter consequences of their own blind favoritism. They had chosen to elevate a criminal over their own successful daughter, and that choice had cost them everything they valued. Jada experienced the most brutal reality check of all. The fake influencer lifestyle she had obsessed over was completely gone. Without Trent's stolen money or our parents' financial backing, she was forced to actually work for a living. For a woman who had spent her entire adult life avoiding real responsibility, the transition was a nightmare. Jada had to take a minimum wage retail job at a local shopping mall just to afford basic necessities and support her children. She spent her days folding clothes and dealing with demanding customers, finally experiencing the exhausting reality of hard work that she had always mocked me for doing. But Jada still could not accept that her own choices had led to her downfall. 2 months after she was evicted from her mansion, she made one final desperate attempt to drag me down. My receptionist notified me that I had been served with a civil lawsuit. Jada had somehow found an incredibly desperate lawyer willing to take her case on contingency. She was attempting to sue me for severe emotional distress and wrongful eviction. She claimed in her legal filings that my actions at the country club had caused her irreparable psychological harm and that I had maliciously purchased her mortgage just to render a pregnant woman homeless. She truly believed she could use the legal system to force me into a financial settlement. She severely underestimated the ruthless efficiency of my corporate legal team. We did not offer a settlement. We did not engage in mediation. We took the matter straight to a judge. The civil hearing lasted less than 10 minutes. My lawyers walked into the courtroom and presented the verified property deed, the legal auction documents, and the documented proof of Trent's massive financial crimes. They clearly established that my holding company had executed a perfectly legal commercial acquisition of a defaulted debt. The judge looked at Jada's lawyer with absolute disbelief. He did not just dismiss the lawsuit. He dismissed the entire case with prejudice, meaning Jada could never attempt to sue me for this matter again. The judge even ordered her to pay my legal fees for wasting the court's time with a frivolous and vindictive claim. I sat in the courtroom and watched Jada's face crumble as the judge banged his gavel. She finally realized that her tears and her victim mentality held absolutely no power in the real world. With the legal distractions permanently handled, I turned my attention to the final piece of business remaining between me and my past. I still held the legal deed to the sprawling suburban mansion Jada and Trent had lived in. The property was massive and located in a highly desirable affluent neighborhood. Some investors might have simply flipped the house or rented it out for a steady stream of passive income. But I did not want another family living inside the walls where I had been threatened and disrespected. I did not want to maintain a structure that was built on stolen money and toxic delusions. I hired a commercial demolition crew. I stood across the street on a crisp Tuesday morning with a hot cup of coffee in my hand and watched the heavy machinery roll onto the manicured lawn. I watched the massive metal claws tear through the roof of the master bedroom. I watched the pristine marble kitchen where my mother had screamed in my face get crushed into a pile of jagged rubble. The destruction was incredibly loud, kicking up massive clouds of dust into the clear blue sky. I did not feel a single drop of sadness as the walls came crashing down. I felt an overwhelming sense of liberation. The physical monument to their fake superiority was being erased from the earth. Once the demolition crew cleared the debris and leveled the ground, I was left with a massive empty lot of prime real estate. I contacted a commercial developer who had been looking for a location to build an exclusive gated community in that exact zip code. Because the land was already cleared and ready for immediate construction, the developer offered me a premium price. I sold the empty dirt lot for an amount that completely tripled my original investment in the distressed debt portfolio. I had taken the very property they used to project their fake status, destroyed it entirely, and turned a massive, undeniable profit. Today I sit in my corner office looking out over the sprawling Atlanta skyline. The floor-to-ceiling windows let in the bright afternoon sun, illuminating the polished mahogany desk and the sleek modern furniture. My crisis management firm has never been more profitable. The high-profile corporate clients who witnessed my swift and absolute handling of the country club disaster realized exactly how ruthless and capable I am when dealing with a threat. My client roster has doubled, and my revenue has reached heights I only dreamed of when I first started this company from my tiny studio apartment. I am no longer carrying the crushing toxic weight of trying to earn the love of people who were fundamentally incapable of giving it. I am surrounded by a chosen family of brilliant colleagues, loyal friends, and a supportive partner who respect my boundaries and value my ambition. We celebrate holidays and milestones without any hidden agendas, without any cruel comparisons, and without any fear of betrayal. I have built a life that is entirely authentic and deeply fulfilling. My biological family had tried to use me as a scapegoat. They had tried to frame me for a federal crime to save a white man who was robbing them blind. They had demanded my submission, my money, and my silence. They threw me into a fire, fully expecting me to burn so they could stay warm. But they severely misunderstood the kind of woman they were dealing with. I did not just survive the fire they tried to burn me in. I bought the ashes, sold the dirt, and built an absolute empire right on top of them. My sister announced her third pregnancy, and my parents actually cheered. While the applause was still ringing in the restaurant, my mother slid a printed schedule across the tablecloth directly to me. It listed school drop-offs, meal prep, and overnight babysitting. When I asked why I was being handed a chore list, my sister snapped that I was 35, single, and had nothing better to do. I did not argue. I just paid the bill in cash and walked out. But the real shock came the next morning at 6 when my phone rang. A detective was on the line asking why my signature was on a fraudulent wire transfer for $250,000. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who tried to